Maria from Windham World Affairs. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Here, I'll speak into this. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We'll be recording this, so thank you Maria for coming and BCTV for helping us with the recording. And good.
Yes,
there we go. And this will be on the website as well eventually, the our website, Windham World Affairs, and also BCTV. So if you need to come back and look at it or share it with somebody, feel free to do that. So help yourself to snacks, drinks. We have bathrooms around the corner for folks that aren't used to this space. Make sure you sign up for our membership list. This is a members-only presentation. And yeah, we'll be happy to tell you about future events we have coming up. So talking about future events, actually, if you want to mark your calendars, this Sunday, we have Will Democracy Survive? Okay, a presentation that's part of our 250 America partnership that we're doing with the Vermont Humanities. And it'll be at 6:30 at Next Stage Arts in Putney. So it'll be a conversation, Will Democracy Survive? Today, though, we're going to be looking at Russian sanctions, okay? And we're going to be looking at the economic response of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we have here as our guest Dr. Christine Abely, and she is the author of this book. She has op-eds that have appeared in the LA Times, The Hill. She's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, MarketWatch. I just listened to one of her podcasts yesterday. And she's appeared on CBS 880, Boston Public Radio, Bloomberg Businessweek. So really proud to be able to have Christine come and join us. She's an assistant professor of law at New England Law in Boston, so she came all the way up from Beantown. And she has her law degree from the School of Law at the University of Virginia. And she has her bachelor's in economics and French studies at Dartmouth. Woo! So thank you very much, Christine, for spending time with us, and I'll let you come on up, and thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much. I'm really excited about the opportunity to be here and to speak with you all about sanctions. So I wrote about the sanctions against Russia in my book, and what I'm going to do today is walk through the history of the sanctions against Russia, as well as some of the more recent developments in the enactment of sanctions. Perfect. As well as enforcement measures that have been taken to try to make the sanctions more effective. So here's a map. So when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the result was a massive sanctions response by many nations around the world. So the sanctions response was, there were a number of jurisdictions that were involved, and historically speaking, this was a really robust sanctions response, because the United States has historically been a proponent of sanctions, has enacted many sanctions programs, but other jurisdictions, such as the EU, have been more restrained in their use of the sanctions and have in fact sometimes even objected to the use of sanctions as the US has employed them. But this was quite different. Here we see the EU and its member states really being an equal partner with the United States, with the United Kingdom, and with a host of other jurisdictions in enacting sanctions against Russia. We see Australia, New Zealand, Canada, we see a whole number of jurisdictions involved in the sanctions response. Japan, South Korea. On my slides I have the whole list, It's quite a list, and so we do have a number of nations, many of these are the member states of the EU, involved in the sanctions response. But I'll go back to this map, because as we talk about sanctions and the power of sanctions and how effective sanctions are, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the sanctions response against Russia is not universal, And so there are major world economies that did not join in the sanctions response against Russia, right? Their economic relationship with Russia continues much as it has always done, and in fact, some countries have deepened and increased their economic ties with Russia as Russia turns away, right, out of necessity and for political reasons as well, right? It shifts. There's been a shifting of economic relationships between Russia and the sanctioning nations, right, to Russia and some of the non-sanctioning nations, right? So when we talk about shifts in trading patterns or economic relationships, certainly we see Russia, right, there's China, India, Brazil, right? These are all major world economies that did not, in fact, sanction Russia. So oftentimes sanctions are imposed by the United Nations Security Council, right, such as sanctions against North Korea. The UN Security Council has enacted sanctions against North Korea. Here, the UN Security Council did not, in fact, impose sanctions against Russia, right, because Russia has veto power on the Security Council, right? There was a General Assembly resolution against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that's not, in fact, the body that enacts sanctions. It's the Security Council, right, which requires that a veto not have been made, right? So that's why we see this multilateral sanctions response, but one that occurs outside of the existing sanctions mechanism of the United Nations, right? And it's coordinated among these nations, but again, a major theme is that it's by no means universal. So that's just a broad overview of the nations sanctioning Russia, starting in 2022 and continuing to this day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the various buckets of sanctions that were enacted against Russia, as well as the various trade measures, to try to bring some order to what the sanctions were, how they've affected Russia, and then what have been some of the effects then on the sanctioning nations themselves, and how we see enforcement occurring today. Okay. So one category, a major category of the sanctions against Russia were financial sanctions, right? Those related to financial markets or financial institutions, right? A number of major Russian banks were sanctioned as part of the sanctions response, right? And these came in different varieties. There were correspondent account sanctions, which didn't block all transactions between nations, right? What they did was made certain Russian banks, right, it limited the ability of those banks to transact in the currencies, like the dollar and euro, of the sanctioning nations, right? Making it more difficult for those financial institutions to conduct those financial transactions cross-border. There were also full blocking sanctions, which completely prohibited financial transactions between the Russian banks that were made subject to them and parties in the sanctioning nations. And what we've seen over time is that as Russia continues to wage war, some of the banks that were made initially subject only to correspondent account sanctions, right, have now been made subject to full blocking sanctions, right? We've seen an upgrade in the severity of sanctions leveled against them, right? So the effect of those sanctions was really to isolate the Russian financial sector in the global economy, and also the ability of customers of those financial institutions to engage in cross-border transactions. And again, when I say cross-border, I mean cross-border with parties in the sanctioning countries, right? And this is quite significant given the percentage of world trade that's denominated in the dollar, right, or the euro. But as we'll talk about later, right, these sanctions don't address a shift in world trade or an economic relationship that becomes denominated in the Russian ruble, right, or another currency not of the sanctioning nations. What we also have seen is a freezing of Russian central bank assets, right? So billions of dollars held by Russia in the sanctioning nations has been frozen, right, and remains immobile. So this is interesting because, as we'll talk about in recent developments a little later, is that there's been a discussion about, and legislation passed in the United States, about not merely freezing those assets, but instead seizing them, using the assets to help pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Because initially, from 2022 until quite recently, in the US, there wasn't the domestic authority to actually seize the assets. The assets remain frozen, but are in fact intact, right? And so the United States has passed legislation that in fact would direct the president to in fact seize assets that are held. And this is quite controversial. There's an upcoming G7 meeting where the United States hopes to persuade its G7 partners that they too should seize rather than merely freeze Russian central bank assets, especially with respect to the EU, but this is quite controversial. And leaders of certain EU member states believe that this would not in fact be justified under international law, and so this is something that is quite contentious, and it remains to be seen whether those assets will actually be frozen as opposed, or sorry, just seized as opposed to just frozen as they are now. So another aspect of the financial sanctions that was notable at the time was disconnections of certain Russian banks from the SWIFT network. Right, so the SWIFT network is a messaging platform that allows banks to communicate with each other across borders. And disconnecting certain Russian financial institutions from that platform is significant because while transactions are still allowed, even if you're not sanctioned, but just subject to a SWIFT disconnection, right, what this means is that deplatforming a bank from SWIFT makes it, practically speaking, quite difficult for a bank to transact cross-border, right? Because the SWIFT platform is the dominant means of interbank communication. There's not a dominant or equally dominant messaging platform that exists. And so what we've seen is the development of alternative payment and messaging systems in Russia and an increase in the use of the Chinese payment system to try to address some of the effects of the SWIFT disconnections and the various sanctions that have been imposed on Russian financial institutions. Right, so this is a major bucket of sanctions imposed against Russia, right, with really significant effects on the Russian economy and on the ability of Russian financial institutions to transact business across borders, right, which necessitates for Russia a realignment of economic relationships. So another major category of sanctions that were imposed against Russia were energy sanctions, right? And this is because Russia is a major producer of energy on the global market. So what we saw immediately after the invasion was certain jurisdictions immediately enacted import bans on Russian origin energy supplies such as crude oil, right? But the countries that did so, like the United States, generally speaking, were those countries which weren't overly reliant on Russian energy supplies immediately pre-invasion, right? So Russian energy made up a very small percentage of US energy use, and so it was easier for the United States and similar countries that enacted such bans to do so, right? It was a harder decision to reach, for example, in the EU, where member states were heavily reliant on Russian oil energy supplies. So a little bit later, in 2022, I believe it was around May, it was announced that starting in December of 2022, there would be an import ban on the maritime transport, on the importation of oil from Russia that had been transported by sea. Currently, oil is still being transported into the EU by pipeline, and that is permitted. It's just a ban on the import of oil transported by sea, right? But that's a huge category of Russian oil imports into the EU, right? And so that decision was more difficult for the EU member states to reach because of their existing reliance on Russian origin oil, right? So the EU member states now are, again, because of this ban, are moving away from their reliance on Russian oil, right? Sometimes that is right, replaced by clean energy, but oftentimes what we've seen is also an increase, for example, in the burning of wood pellets, right? Other energy supplies that are not, in fact, clean. It's hoped that in the long term, these mechanisms will encourage more of a move towards clean energy, but that's not necessarily entirely what we've seen in the short term as the EU member states need to replace their lost source of energy. There is a ban on certain of the sanctioning, in certain of the sanctioning countries on Russian origin LNG. Liquefied natural gas, but again, not in the EU, applicable to all the member states as a whole. There are certain Russian origin LNG restrictions that can be placed if the EU member states so choose, but there's not a wholesale ban like there is in certain of the other sanctioning countries. Right? And so what we've also seen in conjunction with the energy sanctions that was announced in conjunction with the ban on Russian origin oil into the EU was the implementation of a price cap, right? Because Russia is a major energy supplier, the fear was that if the EU just announced this ban on the import of Russian origin oil, that would cause a shock to the world energy markets, right? Because oil is relatively fungible. The thought was if you cut off this major supply and you don't put in place the price cap at the same time, it's going to cause a major shock to the world market. So the goal of the price cap is not to cut off Russia from supplying energy to the world entirely, right? The idea is actually to keep Russia producing oil and selling it in non-sanctioning countries, right? But it's also to reduce the amount of revenue that Russia gains from those sales, right? So this price cap has these two goals at the same time. And so what we've seen is that initially the price cap was fairly successful in doing so. Over time, the price cap became less effective, and that was due to circumvention evasion methods used by Russia. For example, by building out its own tankers to transport oil, right? What's called the shadow fleet or the ghost fleet, right? Or using non-G7 service providers who weren't subject to the price cap restriction, right? The price cap only applies if service providers from G7 nations are involved, right? So turning to alternative service providers to transport oil was another method Russia has used to try to circumvent some of these restrictions, right? So this is both legal and not legal, right? Direct violation of the price cap certainly is illegal. Turning to alternative service providers from non-G7 nations, right, is a realignment of economic relationships, right? And so it shows an interesting feature of the sanctions, right? The sanctions, by their very nature, because they're not enacted by all the nations of the world, right, cannot address all of Russian economic behavior, right? Because there are other economies to whom Russia can turn, right? That's not to say that they're not effective. It's just that they will never, right, completely isolate Russia from the rest of the world. They will never, right, cause an entire collapse of the Russian economy, right? They can't do that because by their very nature, they haven't been enacted by all the nations of the world, right? As I'll talk about in a bit, they can achieve very real gains, but there are some limitations inherent to the fact that these sanctions are not, right, they're not truly global sanctions. Okay, so in conjunction with the sanctions against Russia, we saw trade measures imposed against Russia, and we continue to see the evolution of those to this day. Right, so these are restrictions placed on imports coming into the sanctioning countries from Russia, right, as well as exports going from the sanctioning countries into Russia, right? There were restrictions placed on those activities, right? So if we're talking about import restrictions, products coming from Russia, right, what happened post-invasion was that many of the sanctioning nations revoked Russia's most favored nation status, right? So the effect of this is on some goods, most favored nation status gives a country who has that status, a lower tariff rate, right? Their goods are cheaper to import because the government of the sanctioning nation doesn't tax them as much coming in if it's from a most favored nation. And so revocation of Russia and Belarus's most favored nation status resulted in making those goods more expensive to import into the sanctioning countries relative to most other countries from which imports come. We also saw some bans on items entirely from Russia, right? So it's not that nothing from Russia can come into the sanctioning countries, right? It's certain categories and types of items. So Russian origin gold, fish, diamonds, right? Luxury items, liquor, right? Items which are not systemically important to the sanctioning nations, right? Or which can, cut into Russian revenue. Those items have been banned. Now, other items, right, either took longer to ban or haven't been banned at all, right? Notably things like aluminum and titanium, of which Russia is a significant supplier, right? And if those were banned into the sanctioning nations, it would have negative effects on companies in those nations. So we didn't see originally bans of aluminum, imports of aluminum or titanium. Recently, there has been the ban of Russian origin aluminum by Canada and the United States, and titanium by Canada. And the example of titanium is interesting because the French president reached out to Canada to obtain a waiver for Airbus, right, because of the importance of titanium in airplane production. Right, so banning some of these really important items, right, that Russia is a major supplier of, right, those take longer to be enacted, and in fact are not universally enacted because of the importance of those goods. On exports going into Russia, export controls were enacted that restricted higher tech items from going into Russia, as well as the provision of items to Russian military end users for a much broader variety of items, right? And so the United States triggered what's called the Foreign Direct Product Rule to restrict not just the provision of US origin items to Russia, but also foreign-made items that had been created using US know-how, technology, or US inputs, right? So US export control law is pretty expansive in that it can control US origin items wherever they travel around the world, as well as certain foreign-made items as well. So export controls have been enacted, but in certain cases they are in fact circumvented, right? Because goods, even though it's not legal to ship a good to one country and then ship it on to Russia, right? US export controls attach to the item and follow it wherever it goes around the globe. That's in fact what we've seen happening, right? We've seen this phenomenon of transshipment, where goods will go to a third-party nation and then be shipped on to Russia. So that's something that the United States government and the other governments of the sanctioning powers, right, are trying to address. And so they are looking more at entities in third-party countries, right, to help address that particular problem. So what we've seen is that these sanctions, right, they're very expansive. These sanctions and trade restrictions are very expansive. So that has really significant implications for companies who either do business with Russia or maybe who don't do business with Russia but make goods or other products that, right, their customers may, right, a small subset of their customers may end up shipping to Russia. Their goods may end up in Russia somehow. Or maybe they end up right, violating the sanctions because they don't have appropriate compliance mechanisms in place. Right? And so these sanctions are technically targeted sanctions, what's called targeted sanctions. Right? Sanctions placed against individuals and entities and sectors of the Russian economy, rather than saying, okay, you can't do business with Russia entirely. But they're very expansive, right? So they almost resemble what is in practice a comprehensive sanctions regime, right? Not entirely, but right, it's quite broad, right? And so because large sectors of the Russian economy and right, thousands of targets have been named, this has real implications for companies who are trying to do business with Russia, right, or trying to understand what they can and can't do, right? And the US government has come out with some advisories to really highlight the heightened risks associated with doing business with Russia and to try to provide some advice to companies about how to navigate those risks, right? Because what we've seen is that the US government is now moving more towards strengthened enforcement, right, trying to increase the effectiveness of the sanctions and the export control measures that are already in place, right? And to do so, they're looking at private companies in the US, right? They're encouraging them to make sure that they're complying with sanctions and export controls, that their goods aren't ending up in Russia, right? And they're also looking at parties in third-party nations to ensure, right, that they too are, right, are complying with the various measures in place. So there have been other activities in Russia, right, relevant to US businesses and foreign businesses as well, right? And so along with all the sanctions and export controls and the strictly legal measures that were enacted, right, immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a withdrawal by companies from doing business in Russia, right? It's estimated that over 1,000 companies withdrew from Russia. The number, there are conflicting studies, so there's some debate about that number. Right, but certainly a large number of companies just stopped doing business entirely in Russia or left their operations in Russia, right, not because they were required to, but because either of compliance risk, right, there are a huge number of regulations, it's hard to figure out which ones, right, affect which parts of their business, or just because of reputational risk. And there's also been implementation by Russia of state control of some foreign-owned companies, right, in response to the sanctions, right? There was a French dairy products company that was subject to nationalization, right? And now, especially, as the United States talks about the seizure of Russian state assets, right, rather than merely their freezing. This is something that Russia has pointed to that it might certainly do if its central bank assets are in fact seized by the sanctioning nations. So this is something that we most likely will see more of in the future. There's also been changes to Russian law, right, that will allow for increased imports of goods from the sanctioning country into Russia itself, right? Just sometimes there are intellectual property protections. There were pre-invasion in Russian domestic law that would restrict these activities, but changes have been made to Russian law that would allow more of these goods to enter the country. So we've also seen implications for food and fertilizer, right? And there are humanitarian implications as well. Because Russia is a major food producer, right, as well as a major fertilizer producer and manufactures the inputs in fertilizer as well. Where's my slide? Okay. So what we've seen is we did see a spike in world food prices and some volatility in the world food market and fertilizer markets after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? And that may be due to sanctions, right? And that's part of the phenomenon of overcompliance, whereby companies may choose to overcomply with sanctions, right? Stop doing business related to Russia entirely. There are carve-outs in the sanctions for food and fertilizer trade. Those are allowed, right? Those are legal. Those are carve-outs. Those are exemptions from the sanctions provisions. Even so, even though they exist, right, a company looking at the whole variety of sanctions against Russia may say it's not worth the risk. I'm just not going to engage in this trade, right? That's called overcompliance. And it happens time and again in different sanctions regimes, right? The broader the sanctions restrictions are, the more likely it is to occur, right? So that's a problem inherent in sanctions regimes, including this one. And so the sanctioning nations have tried to publicize the existence of these legal exemptions, encourage companies to take advantage of the exemptions and to continue shipping and dealing in Russian origin food and fertilizer. There was the Black Sea Grain Initiative, of which, to which Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN were parties, right, which allowed for the shipment of grain along a designated corridor, because Ukraine is also a major grain exporter. However, Russia did withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and one part of Russian propaganda is really to lean on the effect of sanctions on world food and fertilizer, right, in order to really emphasize those impacts, and some would say overemphasize, in order to, right, argue that the sanctions should be withdrawn. So certainly sanctions do have some impacts, some humanitarian impact, right, but also there are impacts in this area due to the war itself, right? The fact that the war itself is disrupting grain production and so forth, and as well due to Russia's own actions, such as its withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So, sanctions continue to evolve, and trade controls continue to evolve. Certainly, what we've seen is more of a trend towards enforcement and making the sanctions more effective that already exist. But new sanctions and trade controls do continue to be implemented. For example, we see the ban on titanium, aluminum. We see now more parties in third-party nations becoming sanctioned. And what we see are also an increase in the number of secondary sanctions. Right, so the sanctions that I have described so far were primary sanctions, right? Sanctions enacted against Russian targets for their role in the war, military production, so forth. Secondary sanctions are implemented against not those types of parties, but against other parties for their support of, for example, Russia's military-industrial production. And so there was an executive order the end of last year that provided authority for foreign financial institutions who facilitate significant transactions in support of Russia's military-industrial base to themselves be sanctioned. Now, parties in these foreign financial institutions will now have to make a choice between engaging in these sorts of transactions with Russia or maintaining access to markets in the sanctioning countries, right? So this is quite significant because it really, really extends the reach of sanctions to those in third-party nations, right? It's quite controversial historically, the use of secondary sanctions, right? And some would say it's, right, under international law, there's an open question, right? There's an open discussion of whether secondary sanctions are an appropriate exercise of state power, right? We're using them. The EU has questioned historically the use of secondary sanctions, but seems to be turning more to the use of secondary sanctions to increase the effectiveness of sanctions and to address some of the Russian circumvention activities. So that's something that we're certainly going to see more of in the future. Lastly, I'll get to this question of whether sanctions have been effective. So I think it's important to define the goals of sanctions realistically, right? And to understand what sanctions can and cannot do. So historically speaking, sanctions they don't cause a regime change. They don't stop wars, right? They're not military action, nor are they intended to be, but they don't achieve the same things, right? They're a tool that's used when military action is, right? Sometimes when military action is not the tool being selected, right? And so they're able to achieve things like reducing the revenue available to Russia to wage war, right? That's something they're able to do. They immobilize Russian central bank assets that Russia could otherwise use to wage war. We've seen inflation in Russia, right, rising, not necessarily as a result of sanctions, but as a result of Russia pouring resources into war production. We've seen volatility of Russian currency, right, for the same reasons as well. And we see the price cap, in fact, right, less effectively, more recently as the US has increased enforcement, right, the price cap has cut into the revenue that Russia would otherwise gain from the sales of its oil supplies, right? So they have had an effect. But it's important to remember, right, sanctions don't end wars. They're not going to cause Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. They're not going to topple Putin. That's just not what they do. And historically speaking, that's not ever something that someone could have expected sanctions to achieve, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not effective, right? It's considering that sanctions are by their very nature a limited tool, especially, right, again, this map, when they're enacted by a limited, right, number of jurisdictions, they're not global sanctions, it doesn't mean that they don't have effects, right? It doesn't mean that they're not restricting goods going into Russia, right? Other goods may be going into Russia, right? But certainly there's a higher defect rate of chips and so forth that are now being supplied to Russia, right? It's the sanctions and the export controls make it harder for Russia to wage its war. They reduce the revenues available to it, but they're not, right? They're not going to do, right? There have been some suggestions that perhaps they're not effective because they haven't stopped the war, but that's not, in fact, what sanctions do, and I argue that that's not, in fact, the question that one should use to evaluate their effectiveness. Right, so I will wrap it up there, and thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
sure we have a very inquisitive audience here, so what we're gonna do now is open this up to questions and answers. What we'll do is ask people, if you have a question, raise your hand, speak up. If you could repeat the question
Yes.
before you answer it, excellent. Okay, so questions.
My name is Aiden. Were we supposed to say our name?
You can say your name, yeah, sure, thank you.
I seem to recall that when the sanctions first started, the discussion was that the reason that these sanctions were the tool to use was because there was no realistic military change that could happen which would end the war, because it was a fundamentally stupid war for Russia and it was a political project for Putin. So you needed to somehow get the decision makers around Putin to feel that they are personally being harmed, and when they're at their villas with Putin or whatever, to lean on him to change the policy. So I saw on your list of things that were sanctioned there was individuals, but I didn't hear you talk about it, and I haven't heard very much talk at all in the past couple years about how these sanctions, if they are, can be targeted at individuals, whether it's plausible that this can change thought at the highest levels of Russian leadership, and yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question is about the sanctions against individuals, the sanctions against oligarchs, and whether those could have been expected to result in the oligarchs putting pressure on Putin to stop the war. So yeah, that's a great question. So that's a category of sanctions that I didn't address, right? The sanctions against individuals, wealthy individuals, right, often called oligarchs. It's thought many of them attained their money corruptly, and they use their wealth to support Putin and his regime, and by extension, the war effort. So this was a really noticeable category of sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, right? Because this is where we saw the seizure of yachts and things of that nature, right? Things in the news. And so, right, those were in fact very newsworthy, very noticeable. I actually didn't include them in this presentation because I don't think that those are the most effective or even among the more effective categories of sanctions. You're right? The thought was that this would place political pressure on Putin to withdraw from the war in Ukraine, right? But I would argue that these sanctions against the oligarchs are more important for symbolic reasons rather than their political effectiveness, right? I think there's important symbolic value in the sanctions on oligarchs, the statement by the sanctioning nations that the corrupt accumulation of wealth and their political support of Putin is something that the sanctioning nations disagree with, and so sanctions are placed upon them on those grounds, right? It's certainly possible that that could have led to pressure on Putin, right? There were some rumblings among the oligarchs, right, against Putin, but really not as much as might have been expected, right? And I think that's indicative of Putin's grasp on power, right, and his treatment of those who disagree with him, right, and the risks to the oligarchs in publicly opposing Putin, right, and the fact that I don't think we're going to see a significant opposition movement led by oligarchs, right. I think that the risks to them are too great to oppose Putin publicly, right, and so I think that the primary value of those sanctions on individuals is primarily symbolic. I do think that that bucket of sanctions, there was some thought that this is what could have happened, but no, that didn't materialize. And so I think by far the more important categories of sanctions are the financial sanctions, the energy sanctions, the export controls, certainly. But yeah, I think those are right among the less effective sanctions.
Yeah.
Yes. If the purpose of the sanctions was to encourage Mr. Putin to end the war in Ukraine, could you not say that they are in essence ineffective?
I don't thinks,
And also,
oh, sorry, and I'll repeat the question, yeah, go
my friends
ahead.
in Moscow say that the shelves are full, they buy whatever they want, they go wherever they want. And as long as China and India and Iran are supporting Mr. Putin, then sanctioning by the US really has no effect at all.
Okay, so the question is, so the second question was, because of the economic realignment, where there's increasing economic relationships with China and India, does this mean that the sanctions are ineffective? And the other part of the question was, because some thought was that these sanctions would pressure Putin to stop the war, does that mean that they're ineffective? So I would say no on both counts. And so with respect to the first question, again, it was very unlikely that the sanctions would cause Putin to withdraw, right? That was some of the talk in the media, that maybe the oligarchs would put pressure on Putin, but historically speaking, that's not what sanctions do, right? Sanctions don't end wars. What they do, right, is they have some economic effect, right? They here have frozen the Russian central bank assets, right? The price cap has cut into Russian revenue, right? It became less effective over time, but now has become more effective with increased enforcement, right? We've seen those results, right? We've seen also, despite Russia being able to obtain some substitute goods from India and China, right? It's not a perfect replacement, right? They're not able to entirely shift their supply chain, all economic relationships. It's not a perfect one-for-one substitute. And so there has been real economic effect, and as a result of the sanctions and export controls as well, what the United States and the sanctioning nations are not doing is they're not sending goods to the battlefield that will then be used to fight Ukrainians, right? And I would say that there's value in that as well. Right? I think that United States companies and companies in the EU and those that oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right, should not be engaging in the direct supply, the direct export of goods to the front, right? And so I think because of these very real economic effects, and because of the symbolic value as well, which is not to be disregarded, I think that these sanctions do, right? They have been. They're effective in the sense that, right, they're worth keeping in place. Because at the end of the day, right, it's a tool, right? The United States and the sanctioning nations don't want to engage in direct military confrontation with Russia, a nuclear power, right? That would be a dramatic escalation that the sanctioning nations do not want the world to undergo, right? And so this is the economic tool that it is available, right? It's not perfect, but it is the only other choice, right? And so it's being used in a way to try to slow, hinder, stymie the Russian war effort in ways that's producing results, but it's not a perfect, the economic weapon is not a perfect one, nor could it ever be, given the limitations of the fact that they're not truly global sanctions.
A quick question for you. I was impressed by your map of sanctioning nations. It struck me that most of the Southern Hemisphere simply doesn't seem to be concerned. And I'm wondering if that sanctioning map changes over time, or is that the way it is?
I think that's the way it is, but it's important. I don't think that they don't care, right? I think that they've chosen not to employ sanctions. Because if you take a look at the map of countries that voted with the General Assembly resolution to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right, it's a much bigger map, right? And so I think that sometimes parties who are not sanctioning nations, right, they may have concerns about the use of sanctions. They may have concerns about their own economic welfare.
It's an economic decision.
Right, right. And so I think there's a whole variety of factors. It doesn't mean they don't condemn the invasion, but it just means that that's the decision that they've reached vis-a-vis sanctions.
I was recently in the country of Georgia for about 2 weeks and was able to spend some time in the eastern part of that country where the famous Georgian-Russian military highway is, which is absolutely jam-packed with tractor trailers evading the sanctions, right? Tractor trailers coming in from Iran, Armenia, Turkey, supplying in to Russia, Georgia, of course, profiting through some sort of tariff regime on that. And we've noticed lately Georgia's legislature is equivocating on whether to stay pro-EU or pro-Russia. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on some of that, both in terms of sanctions and how these sanctions or lack thereof affect politics of smaller neighbors. Sleeping next to the Russian bear is not a comfortable place.
Yeah, so the question was about sanctions circumvention in countries like Georgia and other third-party nations as well, especially smaller ones. So I think an interesting aspect of the sanctions response in more recent months has been the turn to addressing circumvention, addressing transshipment, addressing sanctions evasion. And that's through the use of secondary sanctions, as I spoke about, whereby the United States is looking, and other sanctioning jurisdictions are looking at entities in third-party nations, such as with respect to Turkey, the UAE, Kazakhstan, to see where they are violating sanctions, such as by supplying U.S. origin goods and EU origin goods to Russia directly. Right, and so there's been an increased use of secondary sanctions in those aspects. There's also been a move to secondarily sanction munitions production and drone production as well. And so I think that the imposition of secondary sanctions on military producers, military procurement networks, and also on foreign financial institutions who facilitate significant transactions in those areas, right? That's something that the sanctioning powers are turning more to, and I think we're going to see more of in the future. And I think it is a problem. I think it's, right, it's Russia's response to the sanctions. And so I think that's something that we've also seen throughout the course of sanctions, right? We saw the initial mass imposition of sanctions and then continual imposition of sanctions after, but we also have seen Russia respond, right, for example, with the price cap, right, building out a shadow fleet, or, right, service providers either directly violating the price cap or a shift towards Russia using non-G7 providers. I think certainly where we see those direct violations, the United States and other sanctioning jurisdictions are, right, that's the effort, right, to respond to the response to sanctions. And so we see certainly this back and forth, right, continuing to this day.
On the coattails of the last question, I've always been curious about Turkey, in the sense that Turkey is a NATO country, and NATO is the primary institution that is militarily opposed to Russia. I'm surprised that NATO membership doesn't influence Turkey's non-institution of sanctions, and what would happen if the NATO, if any country in NATO was attacked, how would Turkey continue not to even have sanctions as a member of NATO? It seems like a very odd place to be in.
Yeah, so the question was about Turkey's non-imposition of sanctions, right? You see in this list, right? We don't have Turkey. Right, and so, right, and the fact of their NATO membership. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's again highlighting the fact that the sanctions response is not, in fact, right? It's not universal, right? And I think that the problem of transshipment in Turkey is also a question of, right, geography and the actions of private entities, right? And so it's, right, I think it's a large problem there, right, for much of the same reasons as the UAE, right, also as a hub for transshipment, as well as Kazakhstan, right? And so I think that certainly the US and other sanctioning jurisdictions are trying to work with Turkey, the government, to address this particular problem, and right, they're hoping in the future that there will be less transshipment in these areas. And I think it's, right, I think it's certainly an interesting question about whether Turkey will ever impose sanctions in the future, and it's not one I have an answer to. So it's certainly an interesting question.
Also a big holiday destination for Russians.
Yes.
They tend to go to Turkey.
Antalya.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the balance of power in our Congress between the two parties specific to sanctions in an upcoming election year? Specific, of course, to Ukraine.
Yeah, so the question was about the balance of power in Congress with respect to the imposition of sanctions. I mean, I think that what we have seen is fairly universal support for the imposition of sanctions against Russia. I think it will be interesting, not necessarily with respect to Russia, or the legislative branch, but with respect to the executive branch, certainly, depending on how the election turns out, right? I think that certainly Trump is, right, it's historically speaking, and his administration was less supportive of sanctions on Russia than Biden has been, right? Well, certainly post-invasion, but even, right, barring, right, even before the invasion. But I think that one thing that we saw from Congress with respect to the first Trump administration was the imposition of CATSA, which was a mechanism to mandatorily impose sanctions against Russia, right? Oftentimes sanctions are imposed by way of executive order, which allows for executive discretion. So I think that if there's a change in executive, right, administration, Congress has the authority, right, to move more on sanctions of their own power and impose sanctions. And so it will be interesting to see if, depending on how the election comes out, maybe we'll see more legislative action rather than executive action, right? I'm not sure.
Look, I've got kind of a two-part question. You've got aircraft listed on your sanctions by type.
Yes.
Is Boeing and Airbus prohibited from selling aircraft directly to Russia?
So there are aircraft, so the question was about aircraft sanctions. So there are specific aircraft-related sanctions about aircraft from Russia and aircraft parts to Russia. So it's not just about the economic relationships, it's about the airplanes themselves. And there's actually been a recent sanctions action on like an airport part itself going into Russia. And so there are specific sanctions with respect to airplanes themselves from Russia that transit Russia.
You ended your slideshow on effectiveness of sanctions and have fielded a couple questions about it, but I'm still not really satisfied, because if our judgment of the success of the sanctions isn't whether the war has ended, which granted would be a very high standard, I gather that the other point of reference would be whether it has inhibited the Russians or slowed down their war effort. And based on what I've heard, their military industrial factories are working 24-hour shifts. They don't seem to be limited in money or quantity of arms, or the limitations on quality seem similar to what they had 2 years ago. They're not limited by personnel. So what's the bottleneck that the sanctions are squeezing if they're being successful?
So the question is, are sanctions effective even though Russian military production, right, it's increased since pre-invasion, right? And so there are, right, a lot of economists think that, so Russia's currently diverting a lot of resources into military production, right? And that is resulting in increased military production. But a lot of economists think that that is, right, that's a lot of production at the expense of the civilian economy, but specifically with respect to long-term growth, right, and the trajectory of the economy. So some other aspects of the sanctions are they restrict new investment into Russia, right? So we've seen new investment fall off a cliff since the imposition of sanctions, right? That's one area where there's not at all been a one-for-one replacement, right? The investment levels are way down. And also the sanctions try to address the development of new Russian oil and gas fields, right? And technological advancements in those areas from which Russia could gain increased revenue in the future. So I think that's part of it as well, right? Yes, these resources are being diverted into military production. Russia's economy is very hot right now, but I think that that's masking some systemic underlying issues, right? There's certainly high inflation as well, and the growth trajectory, I think, because of these restrictions of technology and the restrictions on investment, it's going to look different over the long term than were the sanctions not imposed. So I think it's certainly possible that in the future, right, all that increased production, right, we'll see some results that may not be so apparent today.
In terms of numbers rather than words, I haven't seen any hard data showing the decline in GDP or trade or any other metric regarding, Russia's position.
So I would refer you, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'd refer you to, I believe it was December 2023, OFAC's chief economist came out with a report about the effectiveness of sanctions against Russia. And so I think that has some really good metrics in terms of, especially with respect to the price cap, right? The extent to which its revenue has dropped. And so that has specific figures. And so I think that's a good resource to start with.
Excuse me, I didn't catch the name of who issued the report?
Yeah, so it's OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. They're the body responsible for administering the sanctions. They're in the U.S. Department of Treasury. So it's the December 2023, I think it's December.
Yeah, December 2023.
Yeah, so the chief economist issued the report. It's just a brief summary on the impact of the sanctions, and so that has the graphs and the numbers and so forth.
But you don't have it available.
We
it's on the
can
website.
post, and I can post it on the Windham World
Okay,
Affairs
thank you.
website.
Yeah.
It comes from the Treasury Department.
Thank you.
You sort of mentioned this in passing in small parts, but I'm wondering if you could say, like, what lessons can you draw from this Russian case for future policy makers considering sanctions? Like, if there's a way to sum up the top things, that what worked and what didn't work and what definitely should be done next time.
Yeah, so the question is what lessons can be drawn from the case of the Russian sanctions about sanctions in general. And I think it's tricky. I think that one thing that worked well, right, was the fact that the United States has closely partnered with the EU in particular, with the UK, right, with Japan, with Australia, and so that multilateral cooperation is something that has made these sanctions so effective. But I think that it's also illustrated the inherent limitation of sanctions, right? Especially when they're not enacted globally, right? And so I think that it's interesting because I don't know that that could be changed, right? I don't know that that's something that you can do differently in a different situation, right? I would say that for the United States, perhaps this multilateral cooperation is more of the future of U.S. sanctions policy rather than a go-it-alone approach. Right? I think that that's certainly a lesson that the United States has understands and perhaps will follow in the future. I think also the importance of enforcement. I think it was always well understood, but I think with respect to the price cap, it's very much apparent. And I think also the importance of secondary sanctions. I think secondary sanctions, right, they weren't imposed early on, following the invasion. I think now, right, secondary sanctions they're politically very sensitive because it's not Russian entities or individuals being sanctioned, it's those in third-party nations. And so I think initially there was, there was not a move towards using them, and now they're being used more and more. So I don't know if it's necessarily a lesson about their importance that will be done differently next time because they're so politically sensitive, that perhaps they would never have been the first move, right? And perhaps it would have alienated the rest of the world to have that be part of the initial sanctions response, right? I think I don't know that would be different, right? We see their importance, but I don't know that the first move in a sanctions response, that the right thing would be to move to secondary sanctions and have the most robust sanctions response right off the bat. I don't know that that's the correct answer.
Yeah, Kel.
Question on the Russian central bank. Do you have any idea what amount of funds are frozen?
Yes, I do. I do have that number. I believe it's 300 billion, in Russian sovereign assets. And that's among the various jurisdictions. And so I'm not sure whether that's just Russian central bank or also their sovereign wealth funds and so forth, but that it's about 300 billion in Russian state assets that have been frozen.
And I believe you said there was hesitation for the seizure of those assets, and there was discussion about using that to reconstruct Ukraine.
Yeah, so
After hopefully this war ends soon.
yeah, so the question was about the seizure of Russian state assets and hesitancy around that. Yes, so the United States passed legislation that would provide authority for the seizure of frozen assets, right? And so there's an upcoming G7 meeting in which the United States later in June hopes to persuade some of its EU, some of its EU counterparts, member state counterparts, to that this is the appropriate thing to do and this is the appropriate course of action. However, that's not certainly among EU member state leaders. I think Macron is opposed to that, doesn't believe it's permissible under international law, and so it's controversial. And
Would it
so
have to be, would all of the EU nations have to agree? Would it have to be a unanimous decision along with the U.S.?
So the question is whether it would have to be a unanimous decision, and the answer is not technically speaking, but in effect, many of those assets are held in EU member states, and so for those assets to be applied to Ukraine, it certainly would be very helpful, and also for the fact of the sanctions response, there's been a coordinated sanctions response. And so I think the United States would not necessarily want to do something very much out of step with the EU, And so I think it's very much interested in persuading the EU that this is the appropriate thing to do rather than as a first step to go it alone.
Just a
I think
comment.
this will be our
I would
last
think
question.
that the United States might be hesitant rather than eager to do that, given the fact that the United States invaded a sovereign country and had a regime change without actual justification for doing so with the second Iraq War. Hypothetically, could the same thing be done to the United States, and could United States central bank funds be seized if we invaded another country without cause?
So the question is whether the seizure of sovereign assets could be used, for example, against the United States with respect to Iraq. Yes, and I think that that's one reason why, the concern by EU member states is that this would be, this tool would be used by others, or it would be argued that it would be appropriate in other instances as well, For example, that Russia might seize assets held in Russia, or that Germany might become liable for reparations from the Second World War, or that the legacy of colonialism would be at issue, and so that this would raise other issues that perhaps shielding sovereign assets would not implicate.
All right, should we keep going?
Sure.
All right.
If we have no problem unfreezing Iran's assets, I don't think we have any problem holding, unfreezing Russia's assets. Do you agree?
Sorry, so the question
I said
is,
if we have no problem releasing Iran's assets that were frozen, what would be the justification for hanging onto Russia's?
the question is about the unfreezing of Iranian assets. So the Iranian sanctions are still in place, right? I think that the sanctions against Iran are in place. There was...
We gave them over, Mr. Obama gave them over $100 billion.
So the question is about Obama and Iran. So there was the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which the United States has withdrawn from and not re-entered. So the sanctions, there are sanctions against Iran. The JCPOA involved the removal of some secondary sanctions with respect to Iran, but not the lifting of primary sanctions against Iranian targets. The United States withdrawing from the JCPOA triggered the snapback and the reimposition of those secondary sanctions. And interestingly, in the Biden administration, the United States has not rejoined the JCPOA, so the secondary sanctions against Iran actually do remain in place at this point.
All right. So what I'm gonna do is let folks take, do we have more questions? So we feeling all right? It's 7:45, we're good. So I want to thank very much Dr. Abely. This time with us. It's been a super informative conversation. It makes a really complex event very tangible. I love everybody's questions, tremendous participation from the audience.